Hello, everyone. We are live. Welcome to the Author Mentor Match YouTube channel. Today we are streaming with a bunch of mentors, talking all about everyone's favorite topic, queries, and by extension of that, all the things you need to submit specifically to Author Mentor Match, but this can help you with querying in general because we require a very similar package to agents, which we can talk about the kind of why we want what we want with submission. But I'm joined by a wonderful group of mentors. I will let each of you introduce yourselves. Who you are, what you're about, what you're mentoring in Author Mentor Match, and then we're going to define queries and give all of our best tips. And you can ask questions in the chat. So, Jasmine, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm Jasmine Sky, back here again on our fancy new Author Mentor Match YouTube channel. So I'll go ahead and plug it again. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, we have some more exciting videos coming. So we have another live on January 8th. Is that right?
9th?
Or 9th. I think it's the 9th. But we also have a ton more short YouTube video tip videos coming to the channel. So go ahead and click that subscribe button if you haven't.
Tons of content.
I am a YA fantasy mentor. I was a mentor last year for round 8, and I'm back this year for round 9, and I'm super excited for another round of Author Mentor Match and finding another YA fantasy mentee to work with.
Awesome.
Oh, and let me do the end of that. And I am agented by Mary Seymour of Kimberly Cameron and Associates. I got my agent in August of 2020. So it wasn't that long ago that I was in the query trenches. I, in fact, did get my agent during the pandemic. So I can talk a little bit about the fact it is possible to get an agent during the pandemic. So we'll get into queries and how to make it stick in an agent or a mentor's mind as we go on in this video.
Yeah. Taylor, do you want to go next?
Sure.
I'm just going in the order you're on my screen.
I'm Taylor. I am an adult horror writer, and I am here to mentor horror, thriller, and speculative fiction, but it wouldn't fit. So I am also agented. I'm agented by Triada. I too got my agent during the pandemic. I am super excited to read all of your submissions and can't wait to find some amazing horror.
Kate?
Oh, it's my turn. Hi, I'm Kate. I write YA sci-fi, and I'll be mentoring YA SFF. So sci-fi, fantasy, speculative, kind of. I'm sort of open to all of those things because I read all of those things. And let's see, I'm read by Andrea Morrison of Writer's House. I also got my agent during the pandemic, but kind of more towards the beginning. So I want to say May 2020. But my memory is terrible, so it could have been any time, really. And my debut novel, Mindwalker, which is a YA sci-fi, so a bit of a rare duck, is coming out next year with Harder and Stoughton.
Awesome.
Amanda, sorry, I've got cat chaos, so I had to mute myself.
Love it.
They're you can't see them, but they're everywhere.
Kate, your accent is so posh.
Don't even start about my accent. It makes no sense if you know my background. So we're just going to go with It's odd.
Well, I'm Amanda Hellender. I'm an adult fantasy writer and AMM Round 9 mentor. And I am I'm represented by Laura Rennert of Andrea Brown Literacy. When did I get my agent? I guess March 2020. So we're all kind of like pandemic babies.
Apparently.
So yeah, I have also been in the query trenches relatively recently, and I have a lot of friends who went through the same thing. So hopefully I have some insight to offer.
Awesome. And I realized I should probably introduce myself. Hi. I am Alexa Dunn. I am the co-founder of Author Mentor Match. So I'm technically the oldest in terms of agent. I was very fortunate. I got my agent in 2016. So I've been with my agent for over 5 years. Blows my mind. What's math? Yes. Don't ask me to do math. I write books. It's fine. And we sold my debut in 2017, and now I write YA thrillers. What a time. I love querying, though. I love querying. And one of my favorite things in Author Mentor Match is helping people with their queries, their query lists. I loved setting up submission for AMM so that it just made sense to me to have it mirror querying. And like it's been so fascinating over like the journey, like refining what we require with our submission guidelines. Like I have feelings about synopses as a writer, but then as someone who runs a mentorship program, fascinating. Hate them as a writer, but there's a reason we require them. And don't worry, we're gonna start with queries and give all of our best query tips, but we will also talk about what is a synopsis, how do you write one, what are our tips, and like you can grill us/me about like why do you want a synopsis? I have feelings. I mean, we can also kind of dip our toes into first pages and partials. We don't want to like go too wide of like covering everything because we have other AMAs, but basically anything you would submit to AMM is what we plan to cover today, starting with queries, an essential skill you need to learn because it's basically how you pitch your book. But Taylor is going to take the lead on breaking down query basics. Don't worry, we're not leaving you alone. Like you're just starting, and then we're each going to like give our favorite tips and like shortcuts and formulas and answer questions. So Taylor.
So I too love queries. I have a little query business side hustle. And my friends are like, you're super weird. I'm like, I love it. So, I mean, I feel like everybody kind of knows what a query is, but basically it's a voicey pitch letter that falls between 3 and 4 paragraphs, and it's up to 350 words. In your first paragraph, you describe the basics, beginning with your the very, very beginning of your storyline. So first your characters, who they are, what they want, and generally you're trying to give a little bit of background. What kind of conflict do they live in? Do they live in conflict? Is their life happy? Is it about to go out the window? The second paragraph essentially sets up the inciting incident. This is the event in your book that kicks off the story. Something I see a lot is that queryers assume that the inciting incident is the climax or the crux of their stories, but it's not. It's what starts the main character or characters down the initial plot arc. It can be as small as a chance meeting or as large as a battle, but it's the first thing that happens, not the biggest thing that happens. From the inciting incident, the query builds to stakes, making the leap from the inciting incident to what the ultimate problem of the manuscript is, and what that means specifically for the main character, not necessarily for the world as a whole, because honestly, your query's 4 paragraphs, so you're not going to be able to encapsulate what your book is like. That, by the way, is one of the reasons we need a synopsis. And that part might take an entire paragraph, and that's okay. The last paragraph deals with, the nuts and bolts facts of your book, its genre, its comp titles, and your word count. And if you're going to put personalization to agents anywhere, this is where you put it, in my opinion. Other people have other opinions. And the way I word it is based on your interest in XYZ, I believe manuscript would be a good fit for your list. That's literally it. It doesn't have to be any more foo-fra than that. And then usually you do 1 or 2 lines about you and your history in the writing industry. For me, that's nil. So I just said that I studied XYZ at college. Although one of my friends who lives in Texas puts cow tipping in his, so that's kind of cool. So that's kind of it. That's your very quick query rundown. Hopefully that was helpful.
Awesome. And let me shoot up just like, since while we're on the basics, we had a question already about word count. Is the whole thing supposed to be 250 words? Does that include the bio and personalization? I find there aren't any hard and fast rules. 250 to 350 is an approximation, like about a page, about 3 or 4 paragraphs. As I've heard some people say it, 250 is like the body of the book, and you get like 100 words for the other stuff, is how I like to think of it. But yeah, anyone else have feelings about word count or length of a query?
That
I
actually
definitely-
feels pretty good. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
That actually feels pretty kind of good to me, kind of because a lot of writers are really worried as well that they really don't have anything to say about themselves in their bio. I think that's something that really worries a lot of writers, like, I don't have any credits, what am I going to talk about? And really keep the main part of the query. So 250 feels really good to talk about your book, and then in 100 words you're just talking about the mechanics, so your genre, your comps, your word count. And then if you don't have a lot to say about yourself, it can really be as simple as Kate lives in England with her cat and her boyfriend. She likes one more than the other, but she won't tell you which. The end. Like, it's
That's
just
good. Is
a
it the
little
cat?
bit it's well, I like the cat more, but the cat likes the boyfriend more, and they can both hear me
it's a
right
love
now.
triangle.
So super awkward. But yeah, so like, don't over worry about it. Like, keep it more about your book. At the end of the day, that's what they're looking for, and that's what's going to make them say yes or no. It's really not going to be you writing paragraphs about yourself.
And in
I
fact,
think
I'd say that's huge query don't is to write more about yourself than the book.
Yes, don't do that. And I do think if you don't have anything to say in your bio or anything you can think of that you want to say, a one sentence thing that you can put in your bio is like, why this book, or why, if you have something in common with the main character, or there was something like the first book I ever queried, which didn't get me an agent, but I don't think this was why. I had a line. It was a book about the main conflict was a hurricane. And I talked about, in like one line, I was like, this book is based off my personal experiences with hurricanes Harvey, Maria, and Irma. So it was like a little bit of like, this is why I'm the right person to write this book, kind of a thing. Or some little personalization in that. I have a friend who wrote a book that was like a French fantasy, and in her bio she talked about living in France for a year. Just the one sentence, like, I lived in France at this time, and if you're ever in Paris, I recommend the chocolate eclairs in this one store. Something a little cute like that. So yeah. I think you don't have to do that, but that is one way you can do your bio if you don't have anything else to talk about.
Yeah. Finding a way to connect the story to you as the writer. Definitely, if I were querying the Ivies, if I had queried that, I would have led with my experiences as a college essay consultant, for sure, in that particular case.
Yes.
I probably would have said something funny about how almost everything in this book is true except for the murder part. I hope.
Would that have been a lie? Would that have been a lie?
Most of the things I wrote are real things that people have done. Anyway, I digress. This is a great question. The hook is the most important part, right? I have read a lot of back covers of books, and I'm still not sure about my hook. What can I do? So there are different schools of thought on this. I want to say I am a hook-driven writer, and my favorite query formula is the hook, the book, and the cook as a way of breaking it down. You start with a hook, then you give the book, and then you get the cook, who you are. Because I queries are marketing pitches. I know that's overwhelming, and like just saying that it's marketing, you're like, no, why? But I like that kind of stuff. That's why I come to people who love queries. We'll help you figure out how to market your book. But it's boiling it down to its essence and using like short, quippy, like eye-catching copy to like hook the reader. What are your guys's like philosophy, tips, tricks on nailing the hook in a query? Or I guess let's boil it down to even further how to start a query, because sometimes it's a line of hook and sometimes it's a more straightforward line. How do you approach it?
I'm in the non-hook school.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Good.
Fisticuff separate.
Everyone can't write a query the same way. Like queries they are individual. Like it's going to be specific to you and your book and style. But if I help you with your query, I will probably come up with a pithy line to start it with, and I'll insert it into people's queries.
And no matter what, the pithy line is super helpful, even like in your own conceptualization of the book. So like it's a good practice. I just don't personally like them in query letters. My theory, if that's what you could even call it, is that if you put the hook up front, sometimes it gives away the juice if you're query too soon and you haven't gone through the actual stakes yet. And then, so like, sometimes you can lose readers. That's my opinion, but I see the utility of it. And I think it's really interesting. And anytime anybody sends me a query with a hook at the top, I say, you can keep this. I would try it with and without. See what happens.
I often do the hook, to Taylor's point. I often do the hook and prefer the hook after the book. I do the book, the hook, then the cook, personally, because I think sometimes the hook is stronger when you've set up what's going on. It depends on the hook too, right?
Yeah.
But I think especially with a SFF story where there's like some amount of needing to set up what's going on in the world. Now that is one thing for I saw a question somewhere that was about sci-fi queries and adding enough world building to understand the stakes. That is a huge concern with us who write especially secondary world stories, trying to boil down your world into as little sentences as possible. You do not want a whole paragraph explaining your world. It's very tempting to do that in a query. You're like, I have 4 paragraphs. One could be about the world. No, can't.
Honestly, I've queried sci-fi, and literally it could, and I had a lot of query options or like versions, and I'm pretty sure the world basically didn't exist in any of them. But to add to what both Taylor and Jasmine were saying, I actually think whether or not you lead with a hook can also really depend on the book itself and the way that putting the hook up front is going to affect the query. So for example, one of my query versions had the hook as the first line. And a lot of people loved that line, but unfortunately it kind of lent itself to a type of query that, as I went through my querying experience, started to feel generic, if that made sense. It almost led me to building the query in a way that made the book feel a little bit generic. And when you're querying YA sci-fi, that is the last thing you want, because it's already so tough that you somehow have to grip them and get them to read on, despite the fact that it's YA sci-fi, and their brain is going, oh my God, YA sci-fi does not sell. So I actually reworked the query, and even though everybody loved that opening hook line, I ended up getting rid of it and putting it later in the query, because then it allowed me to start my query with personal stakes and character. And even though it's the same story, the queries are very, very different. And it's weird because the way querying works is you can never really tell what worked better. And once you have an offer, all cards are off the table anyway. But the query that ended up going to Andrea, my agent, is the one that had the personal stakes up front, the personal and the character, as opposed to the hook.
Well, yeah. And I should say all queries should be character driven. That is critical. And that's also another mistake I think people make. They're like, plot, world, cool. It's like, no, who is the main character? What do they want? What happens if they don't get it? And why should I care? So 100%. I should also say that hooks vary. I just opened up my query. I was like, well, I guess technically you didn't open with a hook, except I did. I don't always do this either. We can talk about, where do you put the book information and personalization, and there are different schools of thought. And it depends book to book, in my personal opinion. And on my debut, I shoved Jane Eyre and Space in their face in the opening line, because that was my hook. But that was technically the book personalization paragraph, not the opening of my query. And so that's like,
I was going to say
them with what's going to catch their eye, but then character-based queries.
Can I also add that is what is, I think so, and I think this confuses a lot of people. I think Jane Eyre in Space is what people call high concept. It's something that you can, so it is a hook, but it's also basically a one-liner. It's an elevator pitch.
If you have one,
put
it in there, but you don't have to have one. And so, but like I looked, my first line is really normal. So that's good.
I might be like totally crazy and a liar, but I think that Save the Cat has a logline template that I have used as kind of like a hook. so just something that really like pithy summary basically as a first line of the query.
Yes. And that's such a useful, and this is related to like the character should be the center of your query. And if you can't figure out what about that character is going to be hooky in some way or another in your query, that's a problem with your book. That's why some people suggest that you write your query, like sometimes, depending on the school of thought, you can write it before you ever draft, or you can write it after your first draft before you revise. Writing your query will help you figure out where you need to revise in your book, because I definitely have had that problem before. I'm very world building focused, and it's very easy for me to get too invested in the world building and lose sight of like, why should the readers care about this character's journey in this world? And that's clear in the queries, right? If I start finding myself writing queries that are too much about the world stakes and not about the character stakes, then I'm like, I need to give my character some stakes. Right?
Yeah. This actually brings up this great question from the chat, which is suggestions on how to make a passive character, especially if passive due to marginalization, and our characters who don't seek power seem more active in a query. And I think this comes up a lot in quest novels where characters can get swept up into things. So this is a great question.
This is my question. Because the book that I got an agent for that I queried is about a character with agoraphobia who absolutely does not want to leave the house or go on any sort of adventure or have any sort of, plot development or character development, which is hard. Yeah, it is hard writing a passive or a reluctant protagonist into a query.
It's very clear what your character wants.
Exactly. I think, you kind of have to twist the words a little bit, but I do think it's effective if you have an effective character where, your character's want is for everything to stay the same. And they're probably going to go to great lengths to make that happen in one way or another. So instead of focusing on what they're actively pursuing, and more like, your typical hero protagonist, think about what they're doing to make sure that that everything stays the same. And I think that if you have, a plot that is really like throwing them to a lot of crazy situations, they'll have to do increasingly more active things in order to make things stay the same. So I think instead of trying to make up kind of like a pretend, wishy-washy want that they might have, you can really focus on what deep down like they want things to stay the same.
This is something I had an editor tell me that I thought was really interesting, which was people are very complex, but your characters, even though we say we want to write characters that are three-dimensional and like mimic people, in reality readers have a better experience reading a character whose every motivation boils down to that one, like every action boils down to that one motivation, right? So even if a real person with agoraphobia might like both want things to stay the same, but also have another want that might come in sometimes, you just gotta focus it all to that one thing.
Right, especially in a query, you're really distilling everything down. Your character is obviously going to have some complex motivations once you get into the book. But instead of trying to explore, their whole psyche, if you can really get it down to like the one or two things that are really driving them.
Yes.
Can I also say that this is a problem in horror? Horror is really hard because there's a sense that like the character is being dragged along into situations they really don't want.
We had a question.
Aha!
Just writing a horror query.
Perfect.
So, I mean, I think if you boil down a horror book to its essence, it will be creepy. Your query will be creepy. I don't think that you need to like inject creepiness and horrorness into your query. It should just be. And there's a problem in horror, as we were just saying, with the passive protagonist, the protagonist who doesn't want to be there, the reluctant escapee of the horror. And I think the dichotomy that you would show in your query, the very reluctant main character and the scary thing that's pursuing them, because that's basically what horror is. It's either dread's pursuing you or something is pursuing you. That difference between the two, that tension between the two, automatically makes your query kind of spooky. So yes and no, focus on the tension because that will make it spooky.
Can I also add, just to kind of meld that into the last question as well, with slightly more passive protagonist is, and this might be controversial, but I always say your query doesn't have to be 100% true to the book. So you might know that your main character might have gotten swept along for the ride to begin with in your book, or some places in your book, and you're like, oh, they're not that active, but there's a good reason for why, so it works in the book. In the query, you can still prioritize active language. Like, let's say your main character's best friend is the one who decides to go off on the quest, and your main character's just going along. You could still say Jane must go on this quest instead of Jane's best friend tells her to go on this quest, because the end result is the same. Jane is going to go on this quest, and inserting her best friend into this query is going to make people go, wait, so who is the main character? Who's driving this book? So it's like, don't feel like your query has to be 100% exactly. Like, you can fudge the details a little bit. Obviously, don't take that too
Lie
far.
about what your book's about.
Yeah, like, your query should resemble your book. Once an agent reads your book, they should be like, yes, this actually makes sense.
But that's just like what we were saying about like distilling down the character motivations, and instead of going into the really complex characterization that you're definitely going to have in your book, just making it easier to digest in a query. Yeah.
This is a tip in general, like distilling everything down. Another mistake I think I see in a lot of queries is a lot of character names. Like, I don't need to know the name of the villain. I just need to know their role, right? Don't say Duke so-and-so who is doing this thing to the main character. You say the Duke is doing this thing to the main character, or whatever, right? Don't give us a ton of names. Don't give us place names. Almost never do you need a place name in a query. Unless the place is like a very important character, or you know what I mean? But almost never do you need to tell us the name of the kingdom or the name of the planet or the name of the high school. Like, we very rarely need to know that, and more names just muddles a query.
But that said, don't be too vague, because specificity and details are what make your query stand out. We know it's hard.
Yes.
So often I'll read something and it's just like, oh, like, can you just like give me little texture? I like texture in a query. What makes your story specific and special? And I actually saw a great example on Reddit this week, where the writer had gotten some advice from someone who was like, tighten it, don't have names, don't put too much in it. And it just said like 5 students are like in a cabin, and one of the comments, and I also was like, but like, who are they? What actually gives this book texture? You could lock 5 people in a cabin anywhere, but why do I care? And they're like, oh, well, I'd written it this way, and immediately was like, see, you just applied like an adjective to each of these 5 people, but I immediately know what archetypes they are, and your query has texture now that's anchoring me interest in the story. I really liked what they had, and I was like, whoever gave you that advice was wrong. Yeah. I was like, yeah, you had it right the first time, writer. Because you need to.
But you don't want to get the names of those 5 characters, because we're going to be like, who's who. You want to give who they are, but not
for that query. Actually, yes. For isolation trope, you can rattle off some names and like give me it. Like, but that's very. You have to know your genre.
Yeah.
and it also depends on how it's told. If it weren't multi-POV, I don't think it would matter, but that book is multi-POV. So it is kind of like, okay.
But it kind of feels like the difference between saying, Matthew, Jane, John, and Steve are locked in a cabin to the Little Bluff mathlete team is locked in a cabin and they must
something like that.
Get out.
Yeah. Like just like a detail. Yeah.
Yes,
a detail that tells you something about them. Oh, it's a mathlete team. What are they doing in a cabin? When a killer comes, what are the mathletes going to do to, overcome the killer? Whereas their names don't give you all that much texture.
Yeah.
I'd say like limiting queries to the most streamlined and also densest information, and trying to leave out kind of like the trivial stuff is so super important. Sometimes when you read queries, I think Jasmine was saying that sometimes when she put the hook in front of her query, it felt generic.
It was Kate. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Kate.
No, it's fine.
Kate. I just think that when you start to lose the adjectives, you lose the threads of your query. That's really what voice is. We talk about voice all the time, and your voice is just the texture you are giving a story. And if you write a generic query and it doesn't have those textures, then nobody's going to want to read it, because the assumption is that your book feels that way too. Yes. The voice of your query should be close, but not the same as the voice of your book, which is a very hard thing to do.
Can we talk about that more? Because there are different schools of thought on this, and I agree completely. Does anyone not like voice in queries? Because that's always my advice, to make queries voicey.
I think there is a line somewhere, but as general rule, yeah, definitely.
Like I saw one once on some forum where like the main character was like a really awful person, and bad, negative, awful person, and the query was in that voice. I was like, nope, bad, do not pass go. Though in fairness, it definitely I didn't want to read that voice, but I was like, no, you can't have the query be mean and insulting, because the character, that's too far.
And I think, it's good to have a voice, especially if your book is voicey, but ultimately a query still is like a professional correspondence. And I have seen queries that definitely cross that line where they're too just joking around, casual. Yeah. And so I think definitely, especially in the body where you're talking about the story, if you can inject some of the same voice that your writing has in the book, it's good.
I think sometimes people as well try to, I know, like sometimes in an effort to differentiate or really get some voice in there, people think, well, why don't I write this from the POV of my main character? And a reason why that often doesn't work, and there will be exceptions, you'll always be able to dig up somebody who did it so well that everyone was just like, oh my God, this blows my mind. But generally speaking, it throws people out. It stops it feeling professional. It stops it hitting the goals of what the query should do, which is why if you're finding yourself resorting to that because you can't figure out how to get the voice in elsewhere, there might be something else going on. Like, you shouldn't have to do that. Like, there are so many ways to make your query stick and active without having to be like the POV character.
And don't forget, most agents don't just read the query. They're going to usually read at least your first page. So focus on making your first page super voicey. As Amanda said, the query is more professional. It doesn't have to be voicey. And it can have a little voice, a little texture, as Alexa said, a little texture, but not necessarily like the full voice, especially if you have a very voicey book with a very like sassy, quippy, unlikable, whatever it is, protagonist. You don't have to put that in your query.
Go ahead.
Queries are written in third-person present tense. I think that's also important to say. Yes. That's the best practice. And like, so-and-so wants this, not so-and-so wanted, or I want. It's like, it's the one time when third-person present is the way to go. It works in some books as well, to be fair, but rarely.
Yeah.
So
definitely don't do your query in second person. I've seen some of that, and I'm like,
so if it's all right with you guys, I've got a bit of an example. So based on what I sort of said, that when I led with my hook, it made the query more generic, and actually because it kind of robbed it of its voice. So let me give you that first opening line from the original query. And it is, in 12 months, the supercomputer grafted to 18-year-old Silsara's brain will kill her, unless the Syntax Corporation kills her first. Now, I tested that line, and actually people really liked it. They're like, it's hooky, I want to know what's going on next. But what it did to the rest of the paragraphs didn't really pan out. It kind of made me then have to explain more than feel, if that makes sense. So we lost a bit of Syl and it became a little bit generic. So eventually, where we ended up with this query is 18-year-old Syl Sarah is determined to die a legend. So that was the new thing. And suddenly it's like stakes and hooks and emotional. It's like, why is she determined to die a legend? Why is she dying at all? So you've still got a hook, but it's lending itself to more voice. So that kind of went on to say, in the 10 years she's been rescuing imperiled agents for the Syntax corporations by commandeering their minds from afar and leading them to safety, still hasn't lost a single life, and she's not about to start now. So really what that allowed me to do is get a little bit of Syl's voice, because her stakes in the beginning of the book is, I'm dying, but you know what? I'm really good at this. And my record is they're going to be chasing it forever after I die. And so kind of taking that hook out and rejigging it kind of allowed me to get her emotion into that query and a little bit of her voice. It's still, it's not overly there. It's not overpowering or anything, but it actually lent itself to a much better query overall, even though I sort of lost that line that nobody disliked that line. It just kind of faded out afterwards.
Yeah. Makes total sense.
I had a thought, a topic, and it flitted in and then promptly out of my brain, which isn't helpful.
I distracted it away. I'm sorry.
Well, let's go
cat.
back while you think about it, Alexa, to what was said earlier. If you don't have a high concept or hook, as we said, you don't need it, right? You start with the character. That's super strong. But you can start with your book information. I think this was mentioned briefly earlier, but if your comps are honestly your like big high concept, if you have, I'm going to throw a random example. If it's like Transformers meets Percy Jackson or something, you're like, this is like unique, and these comps going together, like this tells you, this is going to catch an agent's attention. I don't know if Transformers meets Percy Jackson will catch an agent's attention, but through a random. We can go with the book that's coming out this year, which is Yu-Gi-Oh! Meets Percy Jackson. That's Shiran J. Zhao's middle grade debut. Zachary Yang and the Dragon Emperor. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Meets Percy Jackson, like in and of itself, like that those comps just tell you a lot about the story. And if that's your strongest part in some ways, or if you think that's going to hook an agent, absolutely start with
or a mentor.
Yeah, if it's Jane Eyre in space and that's part of your like book information section, start with that. You absolutely can start with that.
And I can share that if I have it in front of me. I started with, I hope you will consider my YA science fiction retelling title. It changed. We'll pretend it's the final one, Brightly Burning, which is Jane Eyre, and I capitalized that because I'm sassy, in space, featuring a multicultural cast. The novel is a standalone and completed 99,700 words. Got that right under 100K. So.
Another reason to put your book information first, at least what I did, because I normally had my book information. I normally had, book information bio, but I would switch it. I'd put the book information first in the circumstance where if you do like a Twitter pitch event, or if an agent requests specifically, you'll want to put that first. So you'll want to say, you liked this tweet for DV Pit, and then you give the tweet, and then you give the book information or something and then you can go into your pitch. Whatever, if there's a specific reason, or if someone referred you to that agent, so anything like that, you want to put that first.
I also think, since I write high fantasy, I think I do put a very brief housekeeping sentence at the beginning of my query. Mostly because I think it's nice to kind of ground the agent or mentor or whoever is reading it in the fact that this is going to be high fantasy. Starting to read my query, you could be like, is this historical? Is this, it's just like easier to get everybody on the same page, so they're all reading it from the same perspective. But that's, that's, depending on your query, what you're doing. A lot of the stuff is very just dependent on what kind of book you're querying.
That's such a great point, Amanda. Like sometimes a horror query might sound like it could be a fantasy, but knowing straight up that it's horror will give them a very different perception of the query. So
right. Totally.
Right?
On the
Number
other
one-
hand,
Especially like
Oh,
historical
sorry.
horror. Oh, sorry.
on the other hand, unless you have a super high concept thing, kind of pitch like Alexa had for her sci-fi, if you're querying in a genre that you know is very difficult sell,
Yeah.
make sure your housekeeping is at
Sci-fi
the
should go at
bottom.
the bottom.
At
Yeah.
the bottom, at the very end. Like, you just,
P.S.
and I-
This is YA sci-fi.
yes, why sci-fi? Tiny font, tiny
I
font.
mean, at the time I was querying, I was hiding that it was dystopian. So,
right.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's just like sometimes
surprise, it is.
it's just better to be like, let them read the story first, and if they're happy,
Yeah.
they might keep reading despite the fact that suddenly you're like, surprise, it's a YA sci-fi.
Oh.
Yeah, your number one, you don't want to confuse the reader. You want to hook them and get them interested in reading more. And you do that by, you should always be prompting questions. You don't want them to be questions of confusion, but questions of, oh, what happens next? Like, how do they get out of that? It's always, it has to be that like intrigue that you're building. And I remember what I was going to say. In Kidlit, when you open with your character, say how old they are. That's an adult. I don't think it's as necessary, but like if I see a YA query, I want to know 16-year-old so-and-so, if it's middle grade, 11-year-old so-and-so, because it's another thing that helps the reader, mentor, or agent pin what this book is and where it sits. It's also a telltale red flag that something is not YA. If it's like 22-year-old, blah, 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 and we're like, wait. So, yeah.
Speaking of housekeeping, there's that question from Crystal B about a
Yeah.
POC writer. Yeah.
So let's talk about the housekeeping. This is a great one, and there, I guess we could also feed this into things like how do you bring up, the things that are personal to you in the book, as well as we can then slide into comps, and then maybe also get into just all that entire paragraph.
The whole housekeeping paragraph. How to do it, what to do, etc. To this question, I will speak as not a writer of color, but as a queer writer, which I know should not be a comparison, but in terms of this specific thing where you're saying I am writing a book with queer characters, but it does not focus on the marginalization or about oppression of queer characters, they just so happen to be queer, then you say that. You can say that directly in your bio or in your housekeeping. You can say, I am a queer author, and these characters, like writing a non-binary main character in a world where no one cares about gender identity, or where gender identity is not oppressed or something, right? You can say, I am a X author writing a X character, and this world does not focus, or this story does not focus on the oppression of XYZ. I
think it can feel like it feels a little awkward when you're just like throwing it out there. Like, this isn't exactly relevant to my plot, but I do think that it is really important. Like, speaking as like a mentor or somebody who's reading people's submissions, trying to find a mentee. If it's really important to you to find like a mentee of color, or just like somebody who's been traditionally marginalized in publishing, that I know Own Voices is complicated, and you're not necessarily going to reject a story because somebody wrote about XYZ subject and that's not exactly how they identify. But if you're an agent or a mentor who's really looking to help support, or to just like help get that work out there, it's really, really helpful if you as the querier put it in your query that that I am an author of color, I am an author with this background, queer author, and that way you'll know right away if this is the kind of work that you've been looking for, that you want to support.
We talked in our last live about maybe it was not, maybe it was after, we talked about this sort of aspect specifically with writers of color, but it also, with any marginalization, where this idea that like you have to write about the marginalization even if it's not focusing on it, and it's okay to have a character, your main character doesn't have to fit your identity if the story is not, especially if you are a writer of color and you want to write a white main character and like that's your choice and you want to do it. It's okay to have that, and then to still put your identity in the bio to show agents like, I am a marginalized writer, and this story is not about a character with that marginalization, but I'm still a writer, and you say that you're interested in, this could be not directly, this is implied, right? Like you say you're interested in helping authors of color.
Phrasing.
So like, here, I'm an author of color, right? Like that's
Right.
kind of what you're doing, right?
I've had friends in that boat. I had one friend in particular, and the way that she phrased it, she basically said that the story, this aspect of the story, which had in the story has nothing to do with race, was inspired by my experiences as a biracial woman, and that's how she was able to like dovetail that
That's a great
together.
way to do it.
And I've seen people do that. I've also seen authors say, like, let's say it's not about the marginalization specifically. The characters are just there. They'll say like, I wrote this because I wanted to see people who are like me have adventures. Like you could like phrase it like that. Yeah.
I definitely think that's something that lots of people, who I've spoken to, it's something that they want to see more of, is stories about people who share their identity, but it's not about, it's not an issues book, or it's not something about that focuses on any kind of struggle. It's just somebody who shares your identity, going having an adventure, or the story is about them.
Yes,
it's definitely something that is lacking currently in traditional publishing. So,
and then
that
first
absolutely.
Advice, oh, sorry.
I was saying, and another example. Sorry, Alexa. To your point earlier about connecting it, like if the character doesn't exactly share your specific identity. For instance, one of my previous mentors, who is a Black man, wrote a book about Spartacus, and his pitch included like, I was inspired like by Spartacus's sort of slavery narrative from my own heritage as a Black man, even though Spartacus was white, right? So like you can connect things kind of sideways and still talk about your marginalization if you want to.
Yeah. And then I was just going to say, because it comes up with own voices, use it only if you're comfortable. Definitely don't feel like you have to use it. Some people are still really like that as a term, and some don't. So just kind of go with what feels right for you, because that's a question that's come up more and more, because we're in like an evolution period, because it has been used against writers as much as it has helped them as well. So and then actually just my housekeeping for anyone watching, don't play with own voices. Don't give me nonsense for own voices. Like, meaning there's don't stretch it. Like, don't stretch it till it, we know what, yes.
You don't have to use the term own voices. You can say, I'm writing a character dealing with a hurricane, not because I'm an own voices hurricane.
Well, and that's what I mean. Like, I'm not, I don't mean it in terms of like, we're not invalidating anyone's identities or marginalizations. Don't invent them, is all I'm saying, in order to, yes, I've seen some creative uses of it in my tenure.
You can connect it without using the term, the actual hashtag own voices in your query. Like,
because why you wrote something is really interesting, but just don't go on and on about it. Remember that your housekeeping and bio is
one
short.
Sentence. Yes.
Yeah.
Short. Yes.
But okay, so we have more questions. I do want to talk about comps, because I feel like that is something that people really worry about. But quickly, I want to put up this impacts submissions as well as querying in general. Writers interested in writing in more than one genre and or age category, so things that kind of straddle. What advice do you have for finding agents who sell widely? This is like the agent side, but I think this also comes up in like, how do you frame your query when you're straddling lines? Then if you do have advice about the agent part, feel free to offer that.
What's funny is I have seen a lot of people who have signed with an agent, let's say with a YA book, and then their next book was adult or MG, and I haven't really seen it be an issue for that many people. I do, like, my agent does both YA and adults, and I'm basically a new adult writer, so I'm cursed. But if you have that call, that conversation when you're on the call with your prospective agents, also if you have access to something like Publishers Marketplace and you can see some agents sell lots of books in multiple categories, so you might target somebody that way. If you want to write YA and MG, find an agent who does both.
That's pretty easy to find, luckily.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
in
also-
Kidlit,
In Kidlit.
in Kidlit, most agents who rep YA will also probably rep MG or even picture books and stuff. There's a lot of crossover because the editors crossover. What I was gonna say is that, and this might be a little controversial, but I would say focus on the book that you're querying. Focus on getting the best agent you can for the book that you're querying, because yes, these are definitely concerns. There's something to talk to an agent on the phone with when you get to the call stage. They're not small concerns. You definitely should be thinking about them. But as a starting point, what's the book you're querying? Who are the agents looking for it? Because something to remember is that just because an agent isn't looking for an adult horror, say, and you're querying a YA fantasy, doesn't mean that agent won't actually be very well placed to sell that. But they might only be willing. Exactly.
Did
Yeah,
that, right?
my poor agent never wanted to represent, let alone sell thrillers. Surprise! And is gonna end up selling adult for me. Surprise!
But that's the thing. They're willing to do it for clients. They might not be willing to do it at the query stage for a new debut writer who is unproven and maybe doesn't have editors who've seen samples of their work. So yeah, focus on one book.
If my agent flat out was like, yeah, I cannot do adult, she would either find me another agent in the agency to do it for me, or it'd be okay with me getting a second agent. These are all down the line problems that are generally not huge problems. Because I agree, because that's the thing. When I got an agent for my first book, which didn't sell, I was hyper focused on, I will only query, they have to also rep adult. I want to write adult for urban fantasy. Guess who has not written adult urban fantasy and is no longer interested in writing adult urban fantasy? This girl. And also, so YA sci-fi, right? The second time I only focused on the book I was trying to sell in the moment. And so it was only YA sci-fi that I focused on, and I'm glad I did it that way, because all that matters is who can sell your book right now.
And the agent,
think 1 to 2 years ahead, not 5 years ahead.
The agent ideally who's going to offer is going to really like your writing style, your voice, and that is going to come through no matter what genre or age category you write, hopefully. And so they're probably going to make that jump with you, or if they don't, that's okay too. I've seen it both ways. I've seen my agent doesn't rep picture book, but she sold picture books for clients because that's what they wrote, and she sells it. And then I've also seen with others who wrote. I have a friend who writes adult and then wrote a YA or a middle grade book, and his agent does not do Kidlit at all, but found him another agent within the same company who now sells his Kidlit stuff. So. It's fine.
Works out.
It works out. Yeah.
We should
really
talk about genre
stress about
in a query too, because it's hard as somebody who writes genre vendors.
But yeah, let's talk about it.
Want to do that?
Yeah,
it helps people. Yeah.
Okay.
And then no one specifically asked, but I think we should talk more about submitting crossovers to AMM and how the heck you figure that out.
Submit them to me. That's my suggestion.
Genre. Know your genre. Very
I also
important.
think genre, one of the things that I see a lot of people worrying over is like, well, it's not exactly thriller. It's not exactly
what is a thriller?
Or it's not exactly fantasy.
What is a thriller?
Publishing doesn't know.
Yeah. You don't have to worry about like choosing like the most accurate, like on a spiritual level definition of your book. It's a marketing placement thing. It's about where your book would be in the bookshelves in the store. So that's why your agents are concerned.
Yes, that brings us.
We made it.
And that's why comps are important too, not to describe exactly what your book is like in relative to what else is out there. It's, if people are buying these books, they will also buy my book.
Yes, That's exactly
I
it.
would, if possible, I would like to share my my housekeeping for my second book. It's The House on Inglewood is a 90,000 word horror thriller with a time slip element and a feminist thread. And then I went into my comps. Very aggressive, but very specific. So there are like, I think there are like two situations. Like if you're writing, I'm not going to use women's fiction because that's gigantic. But if you're writing like sci-fi, that's kind of an obvious genre. You can kind of place yourself as a sci-fi writer. You might not be able necessarily to place yourself inside of the little boxes under sci-fi, but you can say this is a sci-fi. But if your book has something super specific like that, feel free to be as specific as possible, I think, because it's similar to what we were saying before. If it's high concept and if it can drive your query, be very specific about it. But also really like read about genre and know what genre you're writing. Because honestly, when I first started querying my first book, which was a historical fiction, I was like, I don't know, maybe it's women's fiction, maybe it's historical. I just had no idea.
Well, but to make it confusing, sometimes it can be. Sometimes historical fantasy is women's fiction. It's all about how something is written, because publishing just likes to be confusing, basically.
It does.
And they do it with thrillers too. Like that's why, like, just it's better to be specific in your comps, because there is a huge difference between a cozy Agatha Christie and like a serial killer murder book versus like a domestic suspense with like cheating husbands. They're totally different, and they technically are all in the same section at the bookstore. They don't know what we're doing.
It's the same. If you can specify, like if your fantasy is a quest fantasy versus a romantic fantasy or a fantasy romance, or if it's a hard-hitting contemporary versus a contemporary rom-com, like be specific.
Yeah.
It's gonna help if you're specific.
I love comps and short pitches because I think it's easier to pin down your book that way than genre. Where does this go on the bookshelf and who would read it?
Yeah, so for example, if you're comping Blade Runner and Aurora Rising, you cannot get away with saying your book is a YA speculative fiction. It's sci-fi.
Is this personal experience, Kate?
It is personal experience, because I got so freaked out about the whole, oh my God.
Well, it is technically speculative fiction.
It is technically, but this is one of those times where technically correct isn't quite enough. And yeah, you probably don't want to fudge lines that you just look. I wrote a cyberpunk. There is really no hiding that. It's right on the first page. So there were maybe 5 or 6 queries that went out as speculative fiction. They did not do very well. I can't imagine why.
Imagine.
But also, theoretically, I know you said sci-fi. You could have theoretically you could have just said full of fans of, and they would have figured it out, because those are great novels.
Exactly. Like there's really no hiding.
Lead with a bestseller. That's how. Not a huge bestseller rules. You're not going to comp Twilight. Don't do it. Relatively speaking.
There are also those genres that have really, really specific guidelines of what you have to do in the book in order to qualify, like romance. So just make sure I have seen a lot of queries for books that were queried as romance, but they didn't have the happily ever after. They didn't have the plot structure that was the typical of like the romance beats. So there's just some stuff. It's helpful to research, what exactly does the industry consider these different genres to be.
Well, and know why you're comping something. I've seen some loose comping. What sucks is that it's different for everyone. We all have different opinions, but like ones that I've seen, like I don't have specific examples front of mind, but we're like the book, and you'll be like, oh, so it's like this, and then they'll be like, no, it's because that book had this one tiny thing that's also in common with mine. And my personal philosophy is, when you see the name of a book, what is the top 1 or 2 things you think of? So it's kind of like, is anyone better examples than me? Like, let's say, what's like hot romance right now? like don't cop a hot romance. The Kiss Potion. I know that's weird, but beach read. Don't comp one of those for your depressing women's fiction book, because what you think of when you think of those books is romance. Like, oh, I'm gonna get a swoony romance thread, but it can't be because it's set at a beach. You know?
Yeah, no, I literally, that was my big query mistake, other than having too much world building with the first book I tried to query, is that it centered a fake dating plot. It was a fantasy, centered fake dating. So one of my comps was the wedding date, because I was like, oh, it's a fake dating book. I'm like, no, my fantasy is nothing like the wedding date. It doesn't matter that I should have just said.
Case, I would just say fake dating trope.
Yeah,
we don't use the word trope because all agents know what a trope is, which is concerning. But you can just say like, we'll appeal to fans of the fake dating trope.
Exactly. That's what I was gonna say. You don't have to
doing
find
for
a
isolation.
comp.
So
yes,
really.
Just say the trope. If you have a strong trope in it that's a popular trope, just say it. Yeah.
Hate to love. Fake dating. We love it. We love to see it. Comps. Does someone want to have any? Do we have anything else to say about comps? And then I'll
under 5 years old, if you can.
What?
Yes.
Under 5 years old, if you can.
Yes. At least one of them should be within the last couple years, ideally. You can have one that's older if it fits really well, if one is also very recent.
And I think
recent's better.
And I think a lot of people are using film and TV comps as well these days. And I did this myself as well. But if you're going to do that, it's good to use maybe one film and a book. Yeah. So it's not just, it's these two movies. And it's like, okay, but in a bookshop, those two movies don't really exist. So 1 and 1 is better than 2 movies.
Yes. Another thing you can do is, if you feel like there's a certain vibe to what Alexa said about, like, there's a certain, sometimes if you say a comp that's not the first thing, what you're thinking is not the first thing people think. So you can be specific. You're like, it's the relationship of X comp meets the vibe of X comp, or the setting of X comp, right? You can tell the agent specifically what you think the comps are related to your book about. Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm a more is more type, for better for worse, because my one thing is, if you have to have like 2 comps that are media properties, so cattail, movies and TV, then tack onto that, it will appeal to fans of book and book. I will stuff that housekeeping. I love comps. So you like, just, yes, you got to relate it to a book, but sometimes it really is 2 movies or a TV show and a movie mashed together. Just like, do your best. And also, to be fair, you don't always need comps. I used 0 comps for Jane Eyre in Space, but that's because it's Jane Eyre in Space.
You had Jane Eyre in Space. Your high concept kind of like, it's like a cover roll thing.
Your comp can also be an author. You can say it'll appeal to fans of X author, and that
I have done that before as well, because sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just literally can't find a book, let alone 2, that are similar enough, and that's why you have to go to will appeal to fans of, because that scares the heck out of agents and editors, that if you can't come up with a book that's too similar. So yeah.
It's like a good exercise to sort of do it if you're kind of trying to figure out how to start wording things in your comp, is have a look at how authors do kind of giveaway graphics, or how they do graphics for their books. Because one thing I did recently, and obviously this was more recent, so I didn't use it in a query, but I would have, is something like, if you love the fun, no-nonsense main character in Iron Widow, the action in Aurora Rising, but set in a Blade Runner world.
That's great, yeah.
And so you're giving them so much information about, this is what my book is like, and you're naming a big book, a big film, 2 big books actually, fairly recent. But you're not saying, because for me, one of the worries was, I was like, can I comp Aurora Rising? My book is not in space. Aurora Rising is in space. It's a very big space book. And that's kind of how you get around that. Because I think the Aurora Rising reader would very much enjoy my book, even if it's not set in space, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then I feel like also with very difficult books that you're having a hard time pinning down the genre for. I use 3 books in that line I read you, that housekeeping line. I had, let's see, I'll tell you actually. I did Recursion by Blake Crouch. My book is not really sci-fi, but I needed it for the time slip. The Grip of It by Jack Gems, because I needed the Malevolent House, and Baby Teeth by Celia Stage because I needed the literary portion. So if you can find some comps that'll like vaguely triangulate what you're trying to do, specificity obviously is the best. So
my mentee from last round, his comps was Kristen Kashore's Graceling meets the fun Own Voices trans male romance of Aidan Thomas's Cemetery Boys.
That's great.
That's a good one.
It's a little, you get,
Yeah.
you know, because we couldn't find a modern or a recent, I should say, high fantasy, because there isn't a current YA high fantasy that has a trans male main character. Well, now Aidan Thomas is coming out with his new Sunbury Trials, but like at the, you know, when we were doing it, we couldn't find one. So you can stretch, because it's sometimes, especially if you have a representation that doesn't exist yet, it can be hard to find, or if you're tackling an issue that we need on the shelves that doesn't exist yet, sometimes you have to stretch a little bit to find it. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, this is a good question. This pulls us back to the body of the query. How do you query a multi-POV story? Fantasy specifically in this case, but this comes up with a lot of genres.
It depends on how many POVs. If we're talking just dual POV, you kind of have the character paragraph for both characters, or you have a sentence for both characters' stakes. You can sometimes deal it with 3 POV too. If you're getting a lot of POVs, and even sometimes with 3 POVs, I recommend to people that they just start with whoever the first chapter is about, or if there's like often your first chapter, whoever that POV is like the one that kind of like centers all the POVs, or the one that centers the inciting incident or something like that. So you can start with them and have your query be about just that character, and then say in your housekeeping, this is a multi-POV story following 5 perspectives across this kingdom, or whatever it is, or five characters in this cabin, like a multi-POV story that follows all characters of this isolation trope, or whatever it may be. But I would personally, you guys might, the others might disagree, I would center 1 or 2. I would never center more than that in a query.
Also, you can look at the back cover of your favorite books that have 3, 4, 5 POVs, and see how those get summarized and pitched, because it's definitely not usually just a list of all the different characters and what's going on with them. I think that you'll probably, if you think about your own book, think that there's 1 or 2 characters who are really central to the story, whose POVs need to be in the query.
Yes.
And there's also the option like that I've seen that I'm working with one of my mentees on right now. We're testing approaches. If it is multi-POV, like for us it's thriller, and I also am dealing with this in a book I'm working on pitching. Maybe you don't isolate specific characters and you do talk about the group. Like if it is a great example, which goes in this wheelhouse, an unwanted guest is a multi-POV. I think it has 8 or 9, and it's isolation trope. And like, if I looked at it now, it's over there. I'm 99% positive the back cover copy talks about the group of the concept, not individual characters, because there's too many POVs to boil it down. And on certain books, you can do that.
Well, speaking of back cover copy, I think the way that Tara Sims' adult debut is being pitched is like the 4, the children of the 4 gods of the city of dusk, must band together to save the city when their parent gods abandon it, or something like that. So it doesn't talk about the 4 characters, the 4 POVs. It says these are who the 4 are more broadly, right? Rose, Rose Zavo's debut coming out this next year also is the same as 4 queer teens living in this city that's being run by a corrupt university have to deal with X, Y, and Z, right? So it doesn't go into specifics about the 4 queer teens. It just says we're following 4 queer teens in this city that are having to deal with these things and have to solve this magical conspiracy together.
I think a really easy way to tell is, if your book has equally weighted POVs, talk about the group. If you really are favoring 2, and I find personally when I'm helping people edit, they're like, oh, well, these 2 are the biggest stories. I'm like, then talk about those and say it's multi-POV.
Yeah.
Whatever serves your story best, which is a silly answer, but
But it's true.
It's true.
I was going to say, actually, we've sort of, for a query sort of workshop, there's so many exceptions and different approaches, and it can feel really overwhelming. So I think the only thing I would say is that as best as you can, wherever you can, keep it as simple as you can. Like, you never want to go for the super complicated, the group versus multiple POV query, unless you absolutely have to, because they're so much harder to do.
Yeah.
So as much as there's exceptions to every rule, and you can find a million different ways to do a query that ultimately would land you an agent. Like, if you can stick to the trusted formula, that's probably going to serve you the best.
And if you aren't confident about your query, I do think starting with your housekeeping paragraph is probably best. If you feel like, especially if you're submitting to Author Mentor Match, you don't need to have a perfect query when you're
brings
subbing
up
to AMM, because
should we query differently for an agent? Query, and it's not that it would be different. You can use the same one you would use for an agent, but the stakes are way lower for us, and like it doesn't have to be perfect.
I think from a mentor perspective, that's kind of like one of the things that like I am keeping an eye out is it's like, is there a query that doesn't quite grab me, but the pages seem like totally my
writing
thing.
Queries.
Because that's like the point of like a mentorship is to help somebody get to that point where they can get an agent. So I wouldn't think of it at all as like a point against you. I mean, obviously put the best query forward that you can, but it's not like agents who are just like, they'll reject you because they don't like the way that you put a comma in the sentence or whatever. Like, but mentors are probably going to be looking a little bit more for the meat of your story so that, they want to work with that.
I'll definitely say last year, I very much would read in the queries, unless the query really captured my attention. I'd mostly just read the housekeeping paragraph and then read the pages.
I was going to say put it first, just
put the housekeeping
that way we see
first.
it first. Yeah. But you don't have to.
Honestly, I probably am going to end up reading the pages first because my God, I was bad at writing a query. But my first page, like even now, my first page has barely changed. It's gotten tightened and stuff, but my first page was fire, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. And quite frankly, my query was trash. So, like, I know for a fact that when I'll be reading submissions, your pages are way more important to me than your query, because at the end of the day, the query is, it's not the easiest thing to fix because there's nothing easy about queries, but it's the least important for me of your sub package, because you can rewrite a query, but rewriting a whole book is a much bigger job.
And speaking of first pages being important, go ahead and check out the Author Mentor Match channel, because there's a How to Write a Compelling First Page video that one of our mentors did that you can check out, so you can make sure that first page is fire before you sub to AMM.
Yeah, I'm not mentoring currently, but my personal recommendation, that's why I do focus so much on like hot comps, good hooky high concept, because if that grabs me, I don't care if the query needs a ton of work. I'll go if I'm like, ooh, I'll go right to the pages. And then it's all about well, am I sucked into this? You can always fix a query, and that's what mentors are for. I'd say in something like AMM, unlike agents, not all agents read pages. Most AMM mentors, if they're grabbed by anything in your query, they're going to read your pages, and it's really about pages. But so therefore, even if your query is bad, at least make sure it makes it kind of clear what your concept is, basically, just clear.
Yeah.
don't confuse, no confusion, just like it is this.
I would rather read a 2-paragraph, very simple query that's super boiled down than a too long, confusing query.
Yes.
Yeah.
Confusion is bad. We don't like to be confused. This is a good question. Kind of, what is an example of a good hook? I can definitely pull some up. Do you guys have any that come to mind? Though, funnily enough, the one I thought of, which is from back cover copy, which is my other tip. Read a ton of back cover copy if you're really confused about queries, because they're very similar. The one I thought of has the hook at the end, so maybe this just goes to Taylor's point from earlier. And I can read it briefly. It's Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney, just because like this was my experience. I read the blurb and was like, I must read this book literally immediately. And that's what you want a query to do. It starts off pretty basic. Like, things have been wrong with Mr. and Mrs. Wright for a long time, blah, blah, blah. It goes over, they're on a anniversary. Actually, this is when it grabbed me. Self-confessed workaholic and screenwriter Adam Wright has lived with face blindness his whole life. He can't recognize friends or family or even his own wife, and it builds, right? And then the last line of the next paragraph is, one of them is lying and someone doesn't want them to live happily ever after. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of secrets, and an anniversary they will never forget. And I started reading it immediately because I was like,
That's good.
who's lying? We can't recognize faces. Who? And that hooked me immediately. To me, that's a building hook. That's not one specific line. It's building off of a concept. So.
It's more like a high concept type of pitch, but I'm always a big fan of Gideon the Ninth, lesbian necromancers in space. Like, that'll sell that book pretty easly. Also, another one of my favorite books, Mindwalker by Kate Dillon. Has the hook that she's used in a lot of her material and in the query is really good. Because it talks about that she has this bomb in her brain and she's gonna die. Immediately you're like, how does she get out of this? So you have to know.
And actually, I will say, as much as I dumped that hook line from the query because it didn't lend itself to a longer pitch, I actually use that line in a lot of shorter. So in Twitter pitches, you could it can go up front on something like a Goodreads page at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, a query is a very specific thing. Most readers don't need your query. Most people who are going to discover your book naturally through Twitter or Instagram or social media, they're not reading 250 words about your book. They're reading a short pitch. So yeah, I use that hook. And like I said, it tested really, really well with people. It just did not do very well as a query. And that can happen. So write your ideas down. When eventually, obviously, the book got agented and it was about to go on submission, I literally sent my agent a document with all my query versions and all my pitch versions, because that really helped her get a sense of how I was pitching that book. And she could just pick and choose and be like, this is, I think, what is going to make for the best submission package for editors. So even if your hook doesn't work up front or it doesn't work at the end, or you end up reworking your query, keep all of these things in a document. I promise you will use them at some point.
We talk about this with synopses, which is it's not something that goes away. Learning how to write a good synopsis, you will need.
God,
I wish you went away.
Career, and that's the same with being able to do an elevator pitch. That 1-sentence elevator pitch or the 2-sentence elevator pitch of your book. That's what's used in the book deal.
I cannot
that's what's used
say
in promotion. You need
how mad I was when I found out that I wasn't done with pitching just because I have an agent. What the heck?
Yeah, I'm working on a proposal right now. and basically I actually have it pulled up. I pulled up what I wrote for the Ivies, and it reads more like back cover copy. I don't know if it's what I would use for a query, but Pretty Dead Queens, I read what I wrote and had to submit a synopsis. How dare. But the short pitch is essentially a query. You never have to stop writing these. I'm doing one now for the next thing I'm gonna submit. It's unfair. Why?
Yeah, I had to do one for my second book. So even if you sell 2 in one deal, you still have to write a pitch for the second book. Otherwise, they're not going to let you write it.
Yeah,
it's awful.
How dare.
Never.
Here's a good quick question. Someone asked about personalizing queries. Yeah, for AMM, this bleeds off the other question. Don't personalize. Dear
Right.
mentors is perfect because it makes it way more complicated if you try to personalize. So yeah,
We also
generic
know you're
query for
subbing
us.
to 3 other
Yeah.
people. It's
Yeah.
fine. We don't mind.
And it would get really weird if you try to personalize too, because like, what if you have stronger reasons to apply to one mentor than another? Just generic for AMM. Though actually, do we want to speak briefly? Because just this is generally about queries, but there are different schools of thought on personalization of queries.
My
I'm not a
agent
fan.
doesn't like personalization. She's told me, she's like, I really don't, because oftentimes personalization sounds very like they're
Generic.
stretching
Generic.
to find a personalization. And
You know, I definitely think they are not required in probably the majority of situations because, you know, if you're querying an agent who represents fantasy and you are writing fantasy, you don't need to say, I'm querying you because based on the clients you represent, you are interested in fantasy. Like, they know that they represent fantasy. So I think it's really situations where it's kind of exceptional. Like, it's an actually like really specific, or like I have a friend who queried a book that one of their comps was a book that like the agent represented. So it's like, I'm querying you because you represent this book. Like it's something that's actually specific to that agent.
or if on their manuscript wish list page they have a bunch of like things they want to see and yours actually fits that.
Yeah.
You know.
Something I would add, though, and this is a bit more niche, because I'm actually a UK writer, and the industry is a little bit different here. In the US, I think personalization is really that even agents can't agree over whether they want it or if it matters or if it doesn't. In the UK, if you are a UK writer or you are querying UK agents, it does tend to be a little bit more important here. And it's because it's smaller industry, it's structured differently. So they do like to get a bit more personalization. It's almost more of a cover, they call it a cover letter instead of a query as well. So there are tiny differences. So I actually did personalize my queries to UK agents properly, as in I looked up books they've done. I had to make sure it was a really good fit. Whereas I just looked up my query to Writer's House, and it was literally bam, straight to the book. There's no personalization there.
Certainly here for the vast majority of American agents, it just doesn't matter. It's not gonna increase your request rate. It's not gonna because unless it's genuine, not genuine. It's the right and the wrong word. Meaning you can feel it genuinely, but it could still come across as generic to the agent and as useless buttering up. It's far better to cut to the point of like, here's my hot concept, rather than that. And I just personally tell authors not to stress out, because for me, like it didn't make a huge difference who I got fulls from, whether I did personalization or not. So I'm just like, yeah. And and I just hate that it's extra time for us that usually it's a ton of stress and comes to nothing 9 times out of 10. And it drives me crazy. There are some agents who are a little bit, I think, elitist about it. Like, you'd better personalize. And I'm like, oh, so your time is more important than our, I'm fine. Anyway, do it if it feels right and you have something specific to say, exactly. Or if it's appropriate in the UK. But Writer's House, exactly. They get thousands of queries. Like, they don't really care if you think they're cool. They just want to know what your book's about.
Unless I'm querying you because your Writer's House. Your
Writer's House
because your Writer's House. Like, come on now.
Unless like one of their clients referred you, or they liked your pitch in a pitch event, or you talked to them at a conference. Yes. Like if there's a personal connection,
you listen to their podcast. That was one of mine because I legitimately listened to now you know who I queried. I listened to their podcast. I mean, there's a couple of them, but I was. And I they'd interacted with me before on Twitter as someone who would listen to their podcast. But even then, I guess a lot of people could say that I listened to your podcast, but it's still interesting. Yeah. And with like the agent I signed with, it was just a one line of like, you tweeted this on your manuscript wish list, and I think this fits. But it was literally one line. I did not go on and on.
It wouldn't. Yeah. One line is good.
You said this? I mean, in fairness, bless her. She was so generic. My agent was just like, I like high concept. It did work out, but I was like, what a high concept manuscript wish list. But it's true. That is, my agent likes commercial high concept books. So yeah, it works. We have a couple more questions. We haven't even touched synopses. We'll try to like breeze through that. So this is a word count question specific to this. Would an excessively high word count in an AMM query letter be an auto reject, or are you willing to work with an author to trim down the manuscript? I'd say generally, unlike when you go out in real queries, we auto reject a lot less because the point is to help people.
Yeah.
But our eyes might widen in our skulls a little at that.
I think the difference to me is, if you're submitting a book that's, like in this example, 130K for YA sci-fi, if you're like, I would like some help cutting this down to 100K or less, or if you're like, I can't cut anything, this is just what it is.
It's perfect.
I think probably most mentors are going to be more willing to work with people who are interested in getting their word count to the generally accepted range for their age category and genre.
Yes.
And also, some of it is just a time constraint. If you have a 200K word book,
I'll be let's figure out how
people
to
might not be able to read it before the period is over. So, if it's as long as it's not like it's War and Peace or something, you're probably good.
Also, 130K, like, it's within the realm of reason for a SFF book.
Right. Yeah. That doesn't like blow my mind or anything.
But if you said my 150K middle grade novel, I'd be like, no. my 200K YA contemporary.
Right.
And so it's genre dependent. It also depends, like, they're going to look at your query and your synopsis. Actually, this will take us into why we ask for synopses and go, well, is there enough conflict here to justify the word count? Where do I see the problems in the story structure, and can I help? Is what most mentors are going to ask themselves.
Another tip I would say is, if you are rocking a high word count, and as much as 130K isn't that high for SFF, it is very high for YA SFF, especially sci-fi, which they're not that happy with to begin with. You definitely don't want to skew long. Is I would say, look over those opening pages and get every single word that does not need to be there out, because there's a big difference between a tight manuscript that maybe has a little bit too much plot or meanders a little in the middle, and that's how you ended up with too many words, and 130,000 words where you're like, this needed a line edit.
And then they went on a side quest.
Yes. Yeah, so definitely, if in your first 10 pages, you're like really just only introducing the main character, people looking at that book are going to think maybe there's a reason that it's this long, this many words, and that's not something that can really be addressed in the limited scope of like a mentorship for this book. So if you have I agree with Kate. If you have a really long word count that you are planning to cut down, just show through your query and through your first pages that you can write really tight prose.
Yeah. Yes. So what are do's and don'ts, like no-nos for writing a first page? And let's answer that, but also expand that to, because you guys submit partials. You can submit up to 50 pages to AMM. What are your tips for a tight beginning? So like kind of both sides of this question.
So I think I'm probably on the far end of extremely tight first page, where I really want to see like a killer first line and like at least have some understanding of what in the premise are we dealing with? Like what, if you query a book and you have the premise of the book, I like to be able to see that premise showing in the first 1 or 2 pages. I think that it is going to be dependent on who's reading it. People have, I know some people like a much, much slower start, but it's kind of like when we're talking about the query, having that texture, like having the parts that grab your reader in that first page. Like it should not read generic. It should read very specific to your book, because that is what is going to catch people and make them want to read more.
I'm in the opposite end.
Yes.
But I also think that it's so genre dependent. So, yeah. I mean, in horror, basically the first couple of pages of your book, generally speaking, you're trying to create normalcy for your main character that eventually will
That's
get
a good
broken.
point. Yeah.
So that said, that doesn't mean that I want to hear about people putting on their clothing, waking up from a dream, doing all kinds of generic stuff. Make sure whatever is in the first page of your book really serves your plot. It has to be relevant. And, as you say, if it's textured properly, no matter if it starts with a gun battle or having a simple breakfast conversation with your housemate, that's going to be interesting and important for the rest of the book. So I wouldn't meander.
A tip that I love that I think really helps with both sometimes tightening your word count and also with really gripping people in your story, regardless of where it is, beginning or end, is figure out if you can combine scenes. I like to use the example from Pirates of the Caribbean, the third Pirates of the Caribbean, where like there's a big battle happening while Elizabeth and Will are getting married. So that there wasn't a wedding and then a battle. There is a wedding in the battle, right? Like if you can combine stuff that's happening, and it can be mundane for the contemporary, right? You're like, I know I need to introduce my main character having the first day of school and also this like fraught relationship with her dad. Well, have her start in the car on the way to school being nervous about the first day and arguing with her dad at the same time. Like you can figure out how to combine the scenes. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I would also say voice is, and I think again, genre and category dependent, but in YA specifically, like get your character voice on the first page. For me, that matters way more like than your world or exposition. If you start with a manifesto of why your character is there or how the world came to be, you've probably already lost me. Get that character on the page. I want to know whose head I'm going to be in, and I want to get a sense for if they're going to be fun or if they're going to, grip me or hold my attention. Am I going to want to go to war for this character? And like, it sounds really hard because you're like, it's the first page, you can't do that. And I will start shipping someone from like paragraph 2. Like I will ship them with a piece of paper if the voice is good enough. And then until you give me a love interest, then I'll ship them.
Ship them with a love, ideally anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, get that voice on the page.
Yes.
I agree completely. There's a question that kind of builds off of this. How far into sample pages are you hooked? First page, first 10 pages or more? For me, like, because I'm voice driven, you can get me on page 1 if the voice is really good. Right. And that's what I personally look for. And a lot of mentors read for that as well.
In theory, I'd be like first 10 pages, but in practice, like the books that have really hooked me have been first page. So, I don't think
sometimes
it's like
in fantasy, I give a little more space in fantasy, especially high fantasy. But if I'm not hooked by the end of the first chapter, or if the first chapter is like 20 pages, that's also a no-no. Like the first chapter should be, I think, about 10 pages. And if I'm not hooked by the end of the first chapter, then I'm not going to be hooked.
Which is why so many agents ask for 10 pages. It's a really common number they ask for because you should be able to do a good amount of work in 10 pages.
Yes.
Okay, so does the synopsis cover the entire plot of the book or just important twists in the story? And I'll say before we dive into this, why do we ask for synopsis? We're so evil. It's awful. I know. And I'm sure we all do this when we queried, avoided querying agents who wanted synopses?
Yes.
Yeah, for shame. But
I had one.
So the reason we require it now is you can spot so many issues with a book in either direction from a synopsis without having to request material. And so in fairness, like I know why a lot of agents don't ask right up front because like it's not as time sensitive, but AMM is very time sensitive. And we find that it just cuts a lot of like time down if our mentors can look at the whole package in one. Because you read a query, you're intrigued, you're like, oh, interesting. And you read like the first page, you go, that's an interesting voice, but I wonder, like the query prompts a question. I wonder if they're going to do this. I wonder, I feel a pacing problem. Let's say you read a couple pages. You can often open the synopsis and literally diagnose the problems with the book. And you still might then go, oh, yes, I can fix this. So I like to look at the bird's eye view of the synopsis because it can tell you so much about what's going on in a book, especially thrillers. Like I can see the mechanics. And so that's why we ask for it.
Or if there's a thing you care about, like for instance, I think like Kate, I'm very big about the romantic arc. Like even though it can be a fantasy main plot, if the romantic arc doesn't go the way I want it to, that will often ruin my reading experience. So I will read a synopsis to say like, what's gonna happen with our romantic subplot?
Yeah.
You know, like that. Yeah.
Or if it's a retelling, how are they handling the retelling? If it's,
are they going to change the plot at all of the retelling? Yes.
What's the main theme? You should not be shoving themes into your query, but a good synopsis will reveal, because you see the whole arc, and the mentor can go, oh, I really connect to this. This is something I'd be interested in. So it is all right. So it is both the entire plot of the book and only the important twist in the story. Does anyone want to tackle what is a synopsis and how do you write one?
I'm gonna try.
Yeah, I could
do it.
I could attempt to.
Synopsis is, it depends who you ask, but usually they say 1,000 to 2,000 words, closer to 1,000. I've heard 500 to 1,000, but that seems masochistic. Is that the one that we're asking for? 500 to 1,000? Sorry.
2 to 3 pages. I don't ask any.
That's not 500. Yeah.
I think a page is cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, it's your whole book, but only the main plot points, which is very hard to determine. But basically, if you have your manuscript in front of you, a good practice, I think, is write 1 to 2 sentences per chapter of the main event of that chapter. String them together. If it looks like it's making like plot arc sense, then you're on your way and you can kind of smooth it out and add a little bit of color or take things away that aren't quite as important. But generally, you want to hit the first third, show me the problem that's happening in the first third. In the middle portion of your book, which is the hardest portion of the book, show me why we're keeping going here, because that's the problem of a soggy middle. Why are we meandering around in the dark? And then the last, show me the climax of the book, the crux of the book, and its resolution. Spoilers are important in synopses. That's something people are like, do we have to spoil the book? Yes. We want to know because it helps us to diagnose plot problems across the arc of the narrative. So like the pacing issue is a major one. I have a lot of pacing issues when I write a synopsis per book for this reason, so that I can see where it is. So you can actually pre-diagnose some issues, which of course is why we're asking for it. So is that good?
That's very good. And I'm going to add to that by saying this is another one of those points where I will say, I think a problem a lot of writers have is that obviously in the whole book, plot is complex. It's not your main character does A and B and C. It's your main character meets A, who prompts them to go and do this, which enables B, which kind of circles around to C. Mm-hmm. And it's when writers try to get all of that down in a synopsis that you get into trouble and you end up with an 8-page synopsis. So again, don't feel like you have to represent every plot point exactly as it happens. If you find yourself going, my MC went to the club and she met this guy and this guy took her here and did that and they robbed a liquor store, you could probably just say, my MC is forced to rob a liquor store. That's the important plot. You don't need to go into the, she met the guy and the guy talked her into this. And it feels like cheating. It feels like saying, but actually, all these stuff happens and it's really important because without this happening, she never would have done this. But for the synopsis, it doesn't matter. For the synopsis, it's the main plot. So just And that's a good rule, actually, because if you try to limit your synopsis to maybe 5 or 6 named characters total, you'll start to spot these places where you're like, okay, she went and met this guy, and you put in his name, and suddenly before you know it, you have 20 names.
Yeah.
Start by cutting out those names. If you can cut their name, you might be able to cut their contribution to the plot and still have just your main elements coming through.
It's a
Maybe
really
that makes
helpful
sense.
if you can get somebody who hasn't read your book to critique the synopsis. I find that's kind of the easiest way for people to kind of isolate those sections that aren't really critical to the plot. Like they might feel like they are to you because you're so close to it, but other people are generally really good at pointing out which parts are you're kind of going off on like a sidetracked, and yeah, they can point out which things seem like the crucial plot points to focus on.
Yes.
It's like when your friend is telling a joke and it goes on forever and ever, and the punchline comes and you're like, you really could have done this in 2 lines. That's your synopsis. Your synopsis is telling the joke in 2 lines instead of half an hour.
Yeah, and you don't need every beat of like character emotion and like reaction. And what I mean, I love this as a plancer / discovery writer because I have to write synopses, but I don't know 90% of the things that happen in the book. What's lovely about a synopsis is you can just say, or at least I've done this, she investigates the mystery and like talks to her fellow students. Like, of course, you're submitting to AMM and your book is done. So you might actually be able to say more than that. But when I write a synopsis, it's top line for Act 2. I gloss right over what happens. It's great. Because they don't need to know everything. They don't need to know A to B to C to D to E. They need to know like A to D to M, kind of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I will say if you have a very good plot twist in your book, I think that making sure to set up that plot twist, like whatever the thing is that makes it a plot twist, set it up at the beginning of your synopsis and then give us the plot twist. Because if I read a synopsis with a good plot twist, I will be just as like reading it in the synopsis, and then that will make me excited to read all the parts of it in the book, right? Yes. Yeah. But you have to give us the first beats, because I have seen synopses that just give the plot twist at the end, but missed the reason it was a plot twist at the beginning of the synopsis. And I'm like, why do I care?
When I'm diagnosing thriller problems, I kind of like starting one and then going to the synopsis and like tracking it. Exactly. And then the question becomes, okay, is this actually in the book or is it not in the book? That will determine how large your problem is. Here's a related question. How do you write a synopsis for a dual timeline? I have never done this. So does anyone have any?
I think this is like, I think there are going to be different schools of thought about this, but show it in the synopsis how it happens in the book. So if you're switching back and forth between timelines within the narrative, then do that in your synopsis. I'm sure there are also people who would prefer them as 2 separate things, but if I got one of these, I would want to see how they relate, because it's important. Sometimes, speaking from experience, I wrote a book with a lot of memory and flashbacks, and ultimately I decided after writing a synopsis about the book I had already finished that honestly, the flashbacks and the dual timelininess of the book didn't serve the plot. So I want to see how it relates to the present day plot of your book, if there is a present day, or like which of the plots is more salient. Like, what is the point of this?
The ideal of a truly good dual timeline is that you are revealing information in one timeline that directly like affects at least your emotional resonance with the immediate reveal in once you flip back to the other timeline, right? So yes, as Taylor said, it should piece together like it does.
So so I have no advice on this because I write very simple linear fashion things because my brain is very, very small. But there is a writer named Tess Sharp on Twitter who has done some absolutely fantastic threads specifically about dual timeline synopses and dual POV synopses. If you're not following her, I'm trying to figure out, the sci-fi author in the chat is trying to figure out how to leave a comment, which is about on brand for me, and I can't figure out how to do it.
You have to
but
do
I'm
it in
gonna
a separate computer.
Window.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna send a link to in the private chat, and hopefully Alexa can link it in the comments. Does that work?
Yeah, I can do that.
All right, here I'm doing that now.
We might
And
put a couple resources, including that. And I know
Perfect.
Susan Dennard has a great blog post about writing synopsis. We might put those in the description of this video once we're not live anymore. Alexa or I can add some resources for queries and synopses, including test sharps into the script description.
yeah, but if you're not following her, it's her Twitter handle is Sharp Girl with an E at the end of Sharp, and she does some absolutely stellar resource threads on synopses and queries and pretty much every part of the publishing process. She is absolutely an incredible resource.
So we got this question, and any hints about the AMM application, any essay answers? It's the same every single round, though I'm going to add a couple this year. It's nothing, don't worry. And in fact, I have to go check my own submission page. I'm pretty sure starting last round, I put the sample questions on there so that you could prep. It should be there. If it's not, it will be. It's exactly what you think you're going to talk about. Tell us about this book. What made you want to write this book? Has it been queried? Don't worry. What do you want to get out of mentorship? Do you have any dream agents? Though you know my philosophy. Don't, but we still want to know like what your aspirations are. Where do you see like where do you? I think we have like a what do you see for your writing career in however many years? Stuff like that. Don't worry. We just want to know all about you. It's gonna be great. You're gonna be great. We love you. It's great.
It's
Generally,
just
don't
a
stress
written
out.
interview.
Kind of, yeah, but I love information. I love our application form because we want to get to know you, and then don't stress out too much about like everything we've said, like tips, like yeah, query and synopsis, like try your best, but we don't expect perfection, like genuinely. If we have questions, we'll ask you. So
I think in reality, from what I experienced last round, a lot of mentors will not even read those answers until after they've already kind of boiled it down to their top choices. Like we're not reading. No, I don't know anyone who reads that first, the answers to those questions. Everyone almost always reads the queries and pages first.
I do, but okay.
Okay, Alexa, who is not mentoring this year.
Well, but it goes both ways. I think it's organic. Sometimes you find it on the spreadsheet first and go, ooh. And sometimes you read the query and you go, ooh. It just depends.
It does depend.
So yeah.
I will say, at least maybe I should just speak for myself. I did not read the spreadsheet until after I had already chosen my top 5 or whatever it was. And then I read them on the spreadsheet. And that's...
Actually, here's a good related question. My middle grade sci-fi number follows the main character trying to achieve his inner and outer goals, so introducing the reader to science. Should I or how do I mention STEM without sounding like a lecture? This can come up especially with younger kidlit. How do you talk about the aim of your novel without sounding lecture-y? Cats. Yeah.
I mean, you still want that one sentence. Whatever the reason you're writing this is, or the thing that connects to with you, one sentence. If you are introducing the reader to science, that's very broad. What science are you introducing? Are you introducing them to, the scientific method, or are you introducing them to geology, to earth science? Are you introducing them to biology? Like what science? And then what is your personal connection with like why you care about that, right? If I were writing a book, a middle grade book talking about earth science, I would say as someone who was raised by a geoscientist, I realize most people don't know about how cool the earth is. So this book, whatever, something like that.
Yeah, I would make it personal as opposed to being like, I want to teach kids the lesson of, because that's when you get weird and preachy.
Yeah.
Yeah, or you could be like, I'm a science teacher and the main character in my novel loves science as much as I do. Or, you know, something like that.
Or
like
learns
it
to love science.
learns
as
to
much
love
as I do.
science,
Yeah.
or learns to use science. Like, you don't necessarily have to even say STEM, although I think some agents now do mention, like, in their wish list that they want kind of STEM novels, in which case obviously that's like a buzzword, so use it. But really, you're just saying my main character. It's like if it was a dance novel, you would say my main character loves to dance, like I love to dance, or something like that. Like, it doesn't have to be a massive thing.
I guess I'm just speaking of STEM being a buzzword, STEM is so broad. And in reality, your book about STEM is going to be about one
Something.
aspect, right? So, like, I think you can just say that it's about that one aspect, and an agent's going to be like, oh, cool, that's a STEM.
Yeah.
Like, that
like,
fits in what I'm looking for.
And that said, like, you could say something like, you know, I hope to inspire girls to get as excited about coding as my main character. Like, whatever your little, that's just an example that comes to mind. Like, whatever the little intersection is. Something like that. Yeah. Does anyone want to tackle why publishing doesn't know what it wants? The differences between thrillers, horror, and suspense.
We could probably have a 2-hour conversation about that alone.
I barely know. I've avoided this question on my channel for a long time.
This question makes my skin crawl.
That's very horrific.
This is the real horror story, is this question.
The only thing I would say is that thrillers tend to have that don't want to put it down feeling. So
and the PG clock, right? That's like a pretty important thriller component.
The way I've always heard it described is that horror doesn't have a happy ending, but thrillers might. So,
and mysteries should.
And mysteries should.
The mystery, you should solve the mystery, and hopefully your main character is going to get out of, like, mysteries your main character should get out alive. But a thriller is a mystery where your main character might not. Right?
No, if I'd say in pure thrillers they always get out of it alive. It's not like horror in that sense. I'm thinking of like the big, like, the world's gonna end because the bomb's gonna explode Dan Brown books. Those have happy endings. You cannot have an unhappy, like, much like romance. No one knows.
Nobody.
Because it and things have changed so much. Like, that's the thing. Like, what was a thriller in the 80s is now not what a thriller is now, only because the subgenre of, like, suspense and domestic suspense now dominates the category. And so you can have, like, a Tom Clancy book next to Paula Hawkins or Gillian Flynn, and they're all called thrillers. But then also there's, like, the legacy of Agatha Christie, and there are a ton of thrillers that are really mysteries, but they're also suspense at the same time. And sometimes they have horror elements, but then there are horror books that are not thrillers. It's a mess. Know your comps.
Well, and then you think of, like, ghost stories. Typically, the main character doesn't die in a ghost story, but they do maybe in a possession. Or somebody important dies in the possession. So, like...
Yeah. Well, and some
like,
ghost stories are gothic.
Horror and dark fantasy.
Right.
We're being super useful here, by the way. I
know.
hope this clears this up for you.
Barely knows either.
It doesn't know.
I think the end of the day is, if you want to do something, like, do it well, and it doesn't really matter what the specific genre is.
And the elements are most important. How do they sell it to people who also like this thing?
And with fonts, it's just kind of like, you know, reading in your genre, you'll probably have a better idea of, rather than is something called a horror, or is it called a thriller? You know, it's like this book. That can be more direct.
Also, horror is a lens almost more than a genre, I think. So, like, a thriller with horror elements.
Well, and they all have tension.
Really, like, are you sure?
I guess if you're, like, confused by this stuff, so is literally everybody.
Are we? No, it's because I'm a thriller writer, asterisk question mark, because, like, my next book, a mystery, I think. I don't know. What is it? I don't know.
This does go back to an earlier point, though, that if you are struggling and you're not sure because your book straddles the line, and maybe it's a suspense, maybe it's a thriller, maybe it's a horror, put that at the bottom of your query. because
Yeah.
by that point the agent has read the query. They've sort of got an idea of the story, and so if you get it wrong, you're not biasing them before they've read it. So maybe you've mislabeled your thriller as a horror, and this agent doesn't do horror, so they just chuck it away instead of reading it. Whereas once they read it, they go, actually, this sounds more like a thriller. It's kind of for me. I'm going to give the pages a try.
Or vice versa. I've seen people who are like, this is a suspense thriller. And I'm like, no, this is a horror novel, and actually a pretty good one.
Yes.
You need to target agents who like much darker things. Like, because horror is tough too, because some people flat out won't do it. And sometimes that's bias, and sometimes it's limits that they have. So you really have to know what you have and who wants it. And also because there's like horror that's mostly just dread and spooky, and there's horror that has like gore, and they're all everything is confusing.
Also, check trigger warnings. I mean, I feel like we should
someone
talk about
asked about that actually. Hold on.
Put trigger warnings in your queries. If you have any shadow of a doubt that it should be, then put it in. Really,
content warnings.
Nobody's gonna be like, you know. Yes.
Yeah, nobody's gonna be like upset if you mention it, you know. So always err on the side of caution, and it's just really respectful. It feels very nice to see people doing that, and
I'd put it definitely in the housekeeping. Do I think
that's where I have put it in and seen it before.
Unless some of the triggering things are in the query, like the body of it, put it at the beginning.
Or put, in that case, you can put your housekeeping at the beginning.
That's true.
With the trigger warnings, and then go into
Yeah, and like especially if you have something really dark on your hands, a content warning can be really, really helpful. Though that said, like I know this gets tough if you are a thriller writer. Sometimes your content warning is inherent in the trope you're using, so you can just be upfront about what you're writing. So like dead girls, that can be a content warning for people. And like you just like put it up front and make it
can be a content warning.
It is. Murder is a content warning for a lot of people. So yeah,
I see a romantic fantasy question, and my eyes are just like...
light up.
There you go.
I have things to say.
I have opinions on this. Amanda can go first.
Fantasy romance is really a very specific type of genre. It just like contemporary romance, historical romance, it has to hit the romance beats. So if you don't read a lot of romance, or if you're like, I'm not sure if it hits the beats, it probably isn't a romance. You probably have a romantic fantasy on your hands, which is the core plot is fantasy. I think a good way that I have heard it described is obviously none of these rules are true across the spectrum, but as a general rule of thumb, if you can describe the main plot without describing the romance, you probably have like a fantasy plot. But if you are writing romantic fantasy, you probably also have really strong subplot or intermixed with your main plot relationship between characters. And so more so than just like, oh, there's the, you know, kind of like, if you feel like it's kind of an afterthought that you have a romantic subplot, that's probably not romantic fantasy. That's just fantasy with a romance subplot. It really should be something that feels core to the, like, you know, to the, it's part of what defines your book is the romance.
A fantasy romance is a romance with fantasy dressing, right? Like the fantasy set piece, but it is a romance, right? That is fully the focus of the plot. A romantic fantasy is, you cannot take away the fantasy. In a fantasy romance, you could take away the fantasy elements and still have a story. In a romantic fantasy, you can't take away the fantasy and still have a story.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Baby. Trigger warnings don't apply to sample pages. Only the full should be included in the clear. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because
that'll determine what you're going to request.
Yeah. You don't want. Yeah, if an agent's going to be triggered, you don't want to waste their time and have them request something they don't want to read.
All right. I think we can probably wrap up. Is there anything I haven't covered? topic-wise, or people have more questions at the end?
I'm feeling pretty good.
All right,
Pretty well.
let's end on what is your top either do or don't for a query. If you have like a hot one ready, we can end on like that.
Oh man.
I'll go quickly. My main one, I think I said it, but like I just want to emphasize it. My number one with queries is, why should I care? That is the number one question an agent is going to ask. You need to make them care. And if a person can be reading and be like, the world's going to end, if their question is, okay, why do I care? You've lost them. So it's setting up those specific personal stakes. Make them care.
That's what I was
Make 'em
thinking when
bleed.
you were saying that. That's for me probably the number one thing reading a query is the personal stakes. Especially since I write and read high fantasy, it's very easy for people to kind of get off track and be like, the world is going to end, the kingdom is going to go to war, and everyone's going to die. But if you don't talk about how your character in particular, how does this affect them in a way that it doesn't affect anybody else in the world, and that's why they're the main character, that is what really grabs me.
My top tip is simplify. Your fancy named sand dancer caster with a fancy guild name that is going to make all the sense in the world in the book is not going to make sense to me in a query. Take that guild name, get it out of your query. Give them a generic title. The wizard, the emperor, the witch. Like, sometimes specificity is better, especially if you've got terms that are quite self-explanatory. For example, I used one called mindjacking in my query, which when you're talking about a character who can take over minds is pretty self-explanatory because we think carjacking, mindjacking, and it's not a big leap to make. But if you need 3 sentences of backstory to make the term make sense, just replace the term with a generic term. Just keep it as simple as you can. That way you can use your words on the specific things that are going to make sense instead of confusing.
Yep. If you don't want to use a word that you don't, to that point about wizard or mage, like if you don't want to use a word that isn't used in your book, you can just say magic user or someone with sand magic or.
Exactly.
Right?
Perfect.
Yeah. Avoid proper noun soup. Because remember the dystopian era when every query had like 8 million proper nouns in it, and we were like, anyone else? And actually, I lied. What I actually want to end on, do you have favorite places where people can post their queries for feedback? Because I want to shout out Reddit. Kate, you and I are Reddit people. You're probably like, how do I get help on my query? And there are places, there are AMM resources, but I want to specifically like shout out Pub Tips, which is a subreddit on Reddit.
If you're YA, there's also YA writers on Reddit, which is not super active, but I do see activity on.
Kate, don't make me feel guilty. I theoretically still a mod of that subreddit.
People do tend to like to give feedback on queries there. The only thing I would say is it's Reddit, it's anonymous. Sometimes people are just plain mean and sometimes they're just plain wrong. So
yes, but professionals we haunt Reddit. Like
we do haunt Reddit. I haunt Reddit too much.
I like
I lurk a lot.
Janet Reed, Query Shark.
Oh yeah, Query Shark.
I mean, so she makes you read before you submit to her. She makes you read all of it, and you have to like agree to read all of it, and that you have when you submit a query. But I actually do think reading the queries,
so good,
and all the iterations, it's so helpful. It sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but like incredible resource, really.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a website called Absolute Right. I don't really know that much about it, except for that I know a lot of people who learned everything they know about publishing and querying from that website. I think it's a forum style website.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So Query Tracker has forums as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Well, my cats are being Twitter. Weird. That's why I keep.
Yeah, find a writing community on Twitter. Whoa. That was a lot. I was gonna say, like, you can tweet out something and be like, hey, can someone, look at my YA sci-fi query? Like, do it on Twitter, Instagram, and you might find people.
Twitter is great.
It is a really good resource for finding other writers.
Just like how I made all my good friends.
Me too.
Yeah.
And then YouTube. There are lots of resources on YouTube, including my channel, other channels. Jocelyn, have you done a lot of query videos? I've done like my own subset of them, for sure.
I haven't done any query tip videos. I do have a whole video I'm very proud of about how to find and research literary agents. So if you're at that stage, check out my channel. But there's a lot of people that have query tips on YouTube. You can find a lot of AuthorTube channels that have query tips.
Yeah. I definitely have resources like worksheets, and the question mark is, are they still actively linked? I should know, but do I? But I check my website. I definitely created like a PDF with like all of my cheats for queries and samples. I should know these things, guys, but it's 2021. So many resources, and we're very happy to like do the best we can and help and provide them. So we're so excited to see people's submissions. Well, and also this video is going to be up. If you have questions, you can drop them down below in the comments. We'll like spy on them every once in a while.
To what Amanda said earlier, really getting a second set of eyes is, I think, the number one, even more so than looking at resources is great, especially when you're initially drafting that query, but getting someone else to look at it who is also a writer and also is in the query trenches or out of the query trenches, like at the next stage, it's helpful. Sorry to cut you off, Alexa. That was...
No, my internet's terrible, so I know that Spectrum. If you're American, you know my pain. If you're in a Spectrum market, so thank you everyone for joining us. I think we're good. We got all the thoughts.
Yeah.
Any resources we'll put in the description box. Drop questions in the comments. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at our next live, which is a general AMA with a bunch of mentors on January 9th. So thank you so much, and bye.
Thanks,
guys.
everybody.
Bye.